Hi everybody, and welcome to Special Collections at the George A. Smathers Libraries. We're sorry that you can't be in here in person, but wanted to take the chance to show you some of the materials that you would have seen on your visit today, and that you'll be working with digitally over the course of your assignment. My name is Neil Ware. I'm curator of rare books here at the University of Florida, so I'm responsible for one of the collections in this building that is not the Baldwin Library. And with me,
I'm Hunter McDaniel. I'm going to be the assistant curator to the Baldwin's materials. Susan Altieri, the curator, is out on sabbatical this semester, but she will be available in the coming semesters if you ever need additional help with the Baldwin library.
So what we're going to do here is just show you some material that's emblematic of the collection, and then look at a few items in detail that aren't in the digital holdings of UFDC, and that do speak to the subject matter of your class. So let's get started. So the Baldwin Library, in its composition, has materials that kind of run the scope of children's literature from the 19th and 20th centuries, going back to some earlier periods, mostly in the UK and America. And what the collection is really good for is being able to show not just a really diversity of what was being read and used by children, but also chronologically how these books look over time. So the first things that we've pulled out here are two printings of the same story, The History of Little Tom Tucker. Here, in its first acknowledged printing, this is a chapbook, or just a pamphlet that would have been used by children or by anyone who could afford it in the late 19th century or the early 19th century. You can see it's just some pieces of paper with a few little wood engravings. And really, things like this, you can see they're subject to damage, and they're really quite fragile. So a book like this, or a pamphlet like this, is a real remarkable survival for the period. You can see that 150 years later, it's been adapted into what we would think more of as a modern children's book, complete with illustrations of the same text in both of these little items. So what we can see is how the history of the book and the history of making books for children changes from place and time, but then also in terms of the people and communities who should or should not be reading books. So as we go along, Hunter will talk about a couple more of these items that are really emblematic of the main categories of materials we can find in the library.
So right here we just have some of the highlights of the Baldwin collection. When Ruth Baldwin started collecting materials, she primarily wanted to get her hands on anything that children would have actually used and learned from as they were growing up. She wanted to get an accurate representation of the material that was actually circulating around. Just to show you some of my favorite things and our favorite things in the collection, we have the oversized Salvador Dali copy of Alice in Wonderland. This was illustrated in his style and his take. In this particular page, this is something that stays consistent through all of the Alice books, the trail for the mouse tail. And then on the other side, you're going to see Alice here talking with the caterpillar. And then there's some other elements working through it. And then there's another Alice down at the bottom. As you know, Salvador Dali was an abstract artist, so a lot of the illustrations are going to be very abstract along his style. Another really big, strong item that Ruth Baldwin would have collected. This is the oldest copy of Robinson Crusoe that we have in the Baldwin Library right now. It was published in 1719. And then we've got just some pages throughout here. When picture books first started becoming published, you would really only see an illustration on the frontispiece. Luckily, this one does look like Robinson Crusoe, but usually they would just be a representation of the publishing company or something just to throw an image on there. We didn't start seeing traditional picture books until much later. Mm-hmm. When we did start seeing traditional picture books, we did start to move into more pop-up books, like the one that you will see here. This one was published in the 1950s. It is primarily religiously focused. This page right here is one of my favorite pages. It has the steps up to heaven, loving God, love of one's fellow men, well-doing. And then when you get up here, you have the angels. And then if you're following the wrong path toward hell, you have the hatred of God, hatred of your fellow men, and evil doing. And then behind this rose bush is the devil.
So one of the great things about having collections like this is that you get to see how different technologies adapt, or how different collectors may decide to group things together. So not just Robinson Crusoe, but also things like Gulliver's Travels and The Pilgrim's Progress, a very devotional text, can be collected just because there are many, many different copies of them, or you can find copies of different books that use the same type of technology, like miniature books or movable books, we would say toy books, along with the classic illustrated editions by famous illustrators. This is a work by Arthur Rackham, who was, you can see, contributing material that is printed separately and pasted into the book.
With a little cover to keep it safe and a description on the cover. They wanted to keep the illustrations safe from leaking ink onto the other pages and vice versa. They wanted to preserve the integrity of the illustrations as well as they could.
So when most people think about children's books, and especially things that belong in special collections, you might think of materials like this. But because the Baldwin Library was collected really less categorically, it was bought with things, evidence of use in mind, as Hunter said, but also just by purchasing books in a box. It's a lot less organized than some other collections. The other thing that we see in a lot of them, which I hope you do get the chance to come see in person, are those evidences of use. Inscriptions, dedications, scribblings, things that are broken. So we're not just going to talk about, essentially, with a collection like this, the prettiest books in the nicest bindings, but really what's been done to them since the time that they've been printed, in some cases going back hundreds of years. So this is the bibliographic information for this book, which you can see somebody else has written on the front paste down. So we're going to take a little break and set up some books in the collection that speak about the differences in representation of various communities, and we will be with you in a sec. Taken together, the collections in the Baldwin Library and the Rare Book Collection represent not just diversity of race or religion, but also significant works in the history of disability, ability, and the discussion over physical handicaps and how to address them. So even though the book that's in front of you now looks to be blank, if I hold it up to the light, you can see that it's actually printed in raised lettering. By a man called Samuel Gordon Howe, who was in charge of what then was called the Perkins Institute for the Blind. Before the invention of Braille, or before the adoption of Braille in America, this book comes out at about the same time, there were different studies of how to represent raised characters for people who weren't able to see. Although Braille did eventually win out, it wasn't until the 20th century that actually happened. So in 1835, the first books in this system of lettering, Boston line letter, were produced. And this book is a child's first primer on how to read. So it starts off with vocabulary. It talks about animals, plants. It has a good amount of moral literature in it. But books like this were being printed from specialized presses in the United States and in Europe, for that matter, all over the 19th century, all across the 19th century, and really represented a very diverse population of not just the juvenile but the adult reading public, who were being sought to be reached by different means and different technologies. So while Braille would eventually replace these books, and ultimately while audio recordings would replace physical printed material for the large part, we do have a glimpse of the evolution of technology here, technologies of writing and learning.
We have a couple of books that showcase the evolution of how diversity and race relations were taught and explained to children through literature. This example, The Swimming Hole by Gerald Beam, talks about a community where the children would go swimming, blacks and whites would go together, nobody really cared about each other's color, they all just wanted to have a good time. And then a new boy had came to the neighborhood, and he did not necessarily like or want to play with the black children. So he did something mean, tied their clothes together while they were in the water. He also ended up getting a sunburn because he did not know how to swim and didn't want to go in the water. So at the end of the book, the other kids decide not to let him come play because they decide they don't like his color, the sunburn red. And then he realizes that what he did was wrong and he made a mistake. And ultimately he apologizes and then ends up coming out to play in the pool with everyone, and they teach him how to swim.
And one other interesting thing about this book, again, talking about where it was before, you can see it's a library copy in a library binding with this withdrawn stamp on it. So not only has it been used, but it's been, in some cases, abused by the people who read it. You can see all the little mustaches that have been drawn on a lot of the figures in the book.
We've also got other books in the collection that highlight underrepresented communities that are in a more nonfiction presentation. This particular book right here about growing up in Puerto Rico has an inscription, like Neil was mentioning earlier, to show how it was actually used and did make its way around. This one features black and white photographs and maps that show what it was like to live and grow up in Puerto Rico for children. These photographs show what life was really like. It's not going to be your traditional cartoon illustrated book. It actually is going to show some real stuff and be able to open up people's eyes to the culture that didn't necessarily grow up in this way. And this is how children would learn about other cultures in school and through their friends, would be through these type of nonfiction books that show what life was like other places. As the Baldwin collection is working to diversify, we did start with primarily British and American literature, but being that it was historic British and American literature, representation of minority communities was not as strong. So as we continue to grow the collection and get more contemporary items, we're trying to incorporate more items like this. It's going to be a book of children's poems about race, mistakes, friendship, and it has a lot to do with just growing up in a community where everything is diverse and underrepresented peoples do get represented in this book. Their struggles get represented in their day-to-day life and what it's like to go shopping with dad or buy a pair of shoes. It really shows both underrepresented and overrepresented kids how it's like to work together and live together in a community that works for everyone.
And some of the other subjects that are kind of more mundane, but not you'd think of as emblematic of family life. There are works about separation and divorce in the Baldwin collections. There are works about people fighting, and it's really important to see how the literature has evolved from just being either one way or the other, being either about diversity solely or about one particular community, to showing people represented together and interacting with each other.
So when thinking about underrepresented communities, it's also important to think about the books that represent everything but that underrepresented community. This Dr. Seuss book, To Think I Saw That on Mulberry Street, is a very popular book that you've probably heard of and have probably read as a child. But when you get into it and you start looking through, you'll notice that the neighborhood has just about everything. You've got wagons and pulling carts and marvelous beasts, all on Mulberry Street. But as you go through the book, you notice that there is no representation of any colored people. It is all just these paper-colored individuals throughout. And it just shows that even in the most popular books by Dr. Seuss, communities were not represented around that area.
One of the other interesting things about the selection of Dr. Seuss books, particularly in the Baldwin, is that you can kind of see the evolution of his own work illustrating in the topics of his books, moving from, kind of like Hunter was saying, the exploration or exoticism of having zoos and maybe foreign-looking people, to actually works that are more environmentally focused that we know, like the Lorax, or ones like the Sneetches that have a much more, relevant message. Same author, and, you can track the course of that over about a 30, 40-year period through the collections. This little booklet is emblematic of the ways that material intended to be read by children and young adults wasn't ordered in categories that we might expect to find it. So the title of this book, which was printed in 1830, is A Juvenile Miscellany. And it's essentially a periodical issued in a simple paper wrapper with advertisements for the next series by a publisher in Boston that took contributions from a variety of editors. One of those editors was Sarah Josepha Hale, who, after this little moral story about Mary and Francis, who learned how to write poetry, printed a short rendition about Mary and her little lamb. This is the first place, the first published place where this rhyme appears, and it'll be later followed in the collection in songbooks and in illustrated children's books in the Baldwin Library. It's followed immediately by a work of science, the study of mollusks and other marine animals. So what you might expect a child to read in the 19th century or young adult would be very varied and often encountered in an unstructured fashion in little books like this. You may find in digital contents just the poem or just the reference to a particular author as a children's writer, but looking across collections really allows you to compare the wide variety of media that an editor or a composer or a poet or an artist may find themselves represented in, especially in an age where publication is becoming more fluid and more transient. The last book we have for you today is Robert Cole's Dead End School. Robert Coles was a child psychiatrist who observed firsthand the school desegregation movements of the 1960s. And as you can see in the binding, this book was published in 1968 about a boy whose parents agitate to move him to a better school on a nicer side of town. The illustrations were done by Norman Rockwell, who is usually remembered for more iconic, stereotypically American images, but who was also very closely involved with the production of this book, and did work during the 1960s to display now iconic images of American scenes that involved desegregation, involved race relations, and really put his own weight and his own name recognition behind the growing civil rights movement in the 1960s.
Well, that's going to conclude our very brief tour of the Baldwin Library and the rare book collection. I hope you found material that's relevant and useful for you as you continue on with your assignments and as you continue to work in your class. As you move to the digital realm, and I hope you continue to look at our collections there, a couple of very interesting things to keep in mind. When you're looking at books online, one of the first things to disappear is format. So this little pamphlet And this large, elaborate volume will actually appear flat, static, the same on your screen. But as I'm sure you've discussed in the class, there are any one of a number of considerations for what is marketable, what is circulated, what is collected, and what survives. It doesn't just have to do with the topic. It could be the material, it could be